Trigger warning. Minor mentions of suicide, violence, profanity, talk of mental illness, such as depression, anxiety, and death. Desolation by Audrey. Read by Summer and Taylor. Also, Audrey's link to their Wattpad is in the description, so if you want to read along or just read by yourself, that's also there. Thank you so much, Audrey, for letting us read your story, because it was really, really good. It was really good. Sorry, I just thought I'd get that out of the way. Enjoy. Chapter 1. It's been months, and to Dan, it still feels like it happened yesterday. His boyfriend of 4 years and best friend of 7 years, Phil Lester, had officially been considered a missing person. It was supposed to just be a family trip. Phil was supposed to come back, but someone or something decided that wouldn't happen. So then came Dan's sleepless nights. He'd leave the door unlocked and the windows open just a crack. He had hoped that his boyfriend would come back alive and well. He'd spent hours on the computer, writing and plotting down points on a corkboard, trying so desperately to find some kind of answer as to where he could be and who he could be with. But after months, the Lesters decided to hold a funeral, declaring there was no way he was coming back. The funeral was the last time Dan saw most of his friends. Since that reunion, he isolated himself from everyone he knew, fearing that memories he buried would come to the surface if he spoke to any of Phil's friends. People had tried contacting him, tried inviting him to parties and events, but Dan was so terrified of losing yet another person he cared for. Dan hadn't packed up any of Phil's things. His room was still the same, and the pictures of the two together were still hung on the walls on their house. They had just moved in together. Hell, the house was still new when Phil disappeared. When Phil went missing, Dan being his partner in crime as an internet duo, he took all strength he had left to upload a video to their fans. The video would be the last one he'd make, with or without Phil. His fans were concerned, constantly asking if he'd ever upload again. Dan wouldn't give a specific answer, but mentally, he knew the response. He wouldn't. He simply couldn't. It didn't feel right. In summary, Dan was lonely, sad, and anxious. He did the same thing every day. He'd wake up, shower, eat, watch TV, eat again, and sleep. Maybe, if he was feeling motivated, he'd draw. His family called him constantly, suggesting he get help or talk to someone before Dan was gone too. He had tried to, but Dan barely even spoke as it was. He considered the idea a few times, even researching nearby therapists or coping methods, but he failed to go through with any of them. He knew that talking about it would reopen wounds that Dan was trying so desperately to keep closed. He knew that talking about it wouldn't bring Phil back. His family occasionally called him to say hi, but that was the only time he'd ever socialize. He'd waltz around in Phil's clothes, that being the closest he'd ever get to touching him. However, one night, somebody dared to knock at his door. Dan huffed. He thought he'd make it clear that he didn't want to speak to anyone, ever. It was late, so Dan put on a shirt and climbed out of his bed. He looked around in the hallway, searching for something that he could use as a weapon if the visitor wasn't someone he knew. He spotted a glass vase, tiptoeing to the front door. He tried to look through the peephole, but it was too dark to make out who it was. Either way, it was only one person outside. He held his breath and opened the door, raising the vase above his head, ready to swing, and he dropped it. The glass shattered, pieces sliding across the floor and creating a loud noise. His jaw had dropped, eyes beginning to water. It felt like someone had slammed a hammer against his stomach. It felt like something had vacuumed the breath from his lungs. He wanted to throw up, to scream and yell, to cry and run away, but instead he stood in place, gaze locked on the person in front of him. The person was in a black raincoat, eyes piercing into his. Dan's eyes flickered over every part of him, almost as if he were taking pictures of every feature. The crickets' chirps were drowned out by the sound of rain pouring down outside. Dan opened his mouth, the name managing to escape his mouth after so many years of swallowing it down. After so many years of telling himself he'd never say it again. After so many years of telling himself he'd never see that person again. Phil? Chapter 2.
Dan gulped, and it felt like he was swallowing splinters, his throat dry and burning. He stared at the main front of him, holding his breath. Was this really him?
Phil?
He said again, just to hear himself say it. His eyes watered, his whole body was tense. Yes, it's me. Dan, just please let me in. Dan just watched him as he took off his coat, hanging it on the rack before hurrying back and enveloping him in a tight hug. Dan slowly let his arms slide around him, lips parted, and eyes wide. This felt so foreign, so odd. His skin felt so cold as he wrapped himself around Phil, nudging his head into his shoulder. He began to cry. No, not cry, sob. He sobbed out loud, saying his boyfriend's name over and over. All the tears he's been holding back were spilling over, as if a tsunami had knocked down a cemented dam. He could barely breathe, chest heaving. His legs failed to keep him up, and he fell. Phil sitting down with him as they hugged on the ground.
What happened? Where have you been? It's been years. I thought you were dead. We all thought you were dead.
Dan cried. Not right now, Dan. Let's not talk about it right now. Dan just nodded, letting Phil hold him as he sobbed. Dan awoke by himself in bed, sitting up hurriedly in fear that all of this was a dream. Phil put that thought at ease when he entered the room, a cup full of tea in hand. He handed Dan the drink, sitting next to him quietly. Phil was now shirtless, and Dan unshamedly looked him up and down, crawling over to him and began tracing his freckles into constellations like he used to do. Phil flinched at first.
Is this okay?
He asked, holding his hand back in fear. He made Phil uncomfortable. Phil gulped, shaking his head. No, it's fine. I just forgot you did that, he murmured sadly. The knowing silence that followed, reintroducing how long he had been gone. Dan struggled to keep his mouth shut, not to ask questions, but Phil was so scared. He could see that. I'm so scared. I shouldn't have come back. Dan shushed him, moving into his lap, wrapping his arms around him. Phil relaxed and Dan began speaking.
I'm glad you did. I hated the fact that I never had the chance to say goodbye. But now you're here.
Dan pulled away, grinning at Phil.
You're really here.
They began kissing. It became more heated as Dan realized how much he missed this. He reached towards Phil's thigh, only to have it pushed away softly, and Phil spoke. I'm not ready for that yet. Dan nodded, eyes big. He felt ashamed now, guilty even, that he would be so insensitive to think it would be normal right away, if ever. He'd give Phil all the time he needed. He got off him, going to wash his face and locking the bathroom door. Dan pulled out his phone, going through his contacts. He wanted to tell somebody so bad. All these years of avoiding contact came rushing back to him. He wanted to tell his old friends, or his family, or just somebody. Keeping all of this bottled up was killing him. He took a breath, looking in the mirror. Dan was starting to become himself again. All of this time, he had looked so unreal, so dead, like he wasn't even alive. Like he was simply a ghost. But now, with Phil back even just for one night, it seemed that already all the color had come rushing back to his face. It wasn't so much a frown as more of a neutral expression now. His eyes lighter and posture improved. He reached out towards the mirror, going to touch his reflection, when Phil jangled the doorknob. Dan, can you come back inside? I'm tired and I want to hold you. Dan lingered in front of the mirror for a bit longer before shaking away his thoughts, unlocking the door and flinching a bit when Phil was stood right in front of it. He went to hug him instantly, and Dan giggled, wrapping his arms around him too. He looked out the window as he held him, watching a car pass by, leaving a thought in his head.
When Phil came back, did he bring danger with him? How did he come back looking so clean? What had happened to him? Who did this to him? Were they in danger? Was Phil dangerous?
Dan gulped, squeezing Phil tighter before letting go.
Let's sleep.
They changed into their pajamas, and Dan acknowledged how foreign this felt. They used to do everything together, and now this felt like it was the first time. Dan fought the urge to cry again, and he didn't even know why he wanted to cry. Maybe the dam he had built up wasn't done breaking. He cuddled up against him, his skin tingling as it brushed against Phil's.
Your freckles look different,
Dan noted in the dark of the bedroom. Phil chuckled sadly. They're the same. It's just been a while.
Yeah,
Dan replied sadly.
it's been a while.
Dan was half asleep when Phil spoke again. You can't tell anybody about me, okay? There's people that want to hurt me. They've tried to hurt me. I can't let them get us or anybody else. So for the sake of yourself and me, please don't say anything. Dan nodded against his back, relishing in the warmth and softness of the feeling of another body next to him. He smiled to himself, but only for a few seconds, afraid to let himself be happy. Yes, Phil was back, but he could have changed a lot. this would take some getting used to. He could just focus on the fact that his boyfriend was really here alive, that he didn't have to wait 80 more years to possibly see him again in the afterlife. He told himself that all the pain he went through was worth it, because Phil was here and Dan was here, and they were here. They were together. So Dan shook it off, yawning and promising to himself that he would keep this a secret, adding another pile to the baggage of heavy thoughts he was already carrying.
Chapter 3. Dan woke up to an empty bed again, but didn't have time to worry because Phil's footsteps rang out in the living room. Dan opened the door and peeked out to see him admiring the pictures on the wall, holding one of himself. "Morning," Dan greeted. Phil jumped, whipping around. Dan giggled, raising an eyebrow. "It's just me, calm down." Phil forced a nervous laugh and cleared his throat, setting the picture back up. He was shirtless, and Dan took the opportunity to trudge over, setting his hands on his bare shoulders. Dan beamed to himself as he admired his boyfriend's body, the smile fading when it looked different than he remembered. "It's been so long that I forgot what your body looks like. I could have sworn you had a birthmark right here," Daniel mumbled, pointing at his collarbone. Phil flashed a sad smile, turning around.
"It's over here, remember?"
Dan saw the birthmark and nodded, wrapping his arms around the back of him. "I missed you. I missed this. Every single day hurt worse. I don't know how I lived. Hell, I wasn't. I was just surviving. What about you? Did you miss me?" Phil began, but Dan's phone went off. He looked at his device to see it was a reminder that he had therapy in an hour. Dan flashed him a sad smile, kissing his forehead before walking away and grabbing his phone. He turned around, about to yell to Phil, but when he moved, Phil was right behind him. Dan jumped, forcing a nervous laugh. "You scared me," he exhaled, putting a hand to his chest. "I have my first therapy appointment, so I'll see you in a bit, okay? Don't go anywhere." He began to walk out the door when Phil grabbed his arm, turning him to face him. Their eyes locked.
"Dan, you can't tell your therapist I'm here. You can't. You'll only put yourself in danger."
"Who are you running from?" Dan finally asked, eyebrows furrowed. "Phil, who hurt you?"
"I can't talk about it."
"But when, Phil? When you were here, you told me everything."
"It's not the same."
Phil whispered, worry in his expression.
"This is different, and you know that."
"But I'm scared and confused," Dan tried.
"And you think I'm not?"
"Phil, I just..."
"Please, just trust me. I'm doing this to keep you safe, to keep us safe."
Phil told him.
"I'll tell you one day."
They looked at each other for a moment, Dan's eyes disappointed and Phil's begging. "I love you," Dan spoke softly, voice wavering. They hadn't said it since he got back. Phil kissed him, a gentle touch of the lips before pulling away.
"I love you too."
Dan stared at Phil for a bit, confusion leaking from his head, but turned away and headed out the door. He made it to the building, and while he sat and waited, he thought of Phil. He thought once Phil came back, he'd feel better, but this wasn't helping. Sure, it was nice hearing his boyfriend was alive, but how alive is he really? Dan hated going on with so many unanswered questions, having the same amount of confusion and fear he had when Phil was missing. He was gone for so long, and Dan was supposed to just wait? His thoughts were cut off when a man peeked his head out the door.
"Dan Howell?"
The brunette stood on shaky legs, hands beginning to sweat. The man shot a welcoming grin before leading Dan into their room, and they sat.
"First day for you? I'm Dr. Vero. Nice to meet you,"
the man said. Dan smiled sheepishly, shaking his head.
"So I'm going to ask you some simple questions to get to know you better. Please know that this will remain confidential and everything you say will remain quiet. I will only tell someone if I fear for your life or someone else's. Clear?"
"Crystal," he breathed out, fidgeting with his hands. He answered questions back and forth, voice monotone as he gazed out the window. Yes, he was unhappy and anxious. No, he couldn't sleep at night. Yes, he has problems with self-image, blah blah blah. But one question stuck out to him.
"Have you lost a loved one recently?"
Dan sat up, finally turning to look at the doctor. "What?"
"Have you lost..."
"No, I heard you. I just, He looked down at his feet, Phil's voice ringing through his mind.
"Dan, you can't tell your therapist I'm here."
Dan bit his lip. As long as he didn't say Phil's name, maybe it was okay. "Well, sort of. My dog ran away for a bit, but he came back. I thought he was dead. Everybody did."
"And how do you feel now that he's back? Better? Worse?"
Dan shut his eyes. "I don't know. I just wish I knew where he went and what happened to him. But he won't tell me. I mean, he's a dog, but I feel like I'm trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. He's not the same. I'm so scared and worried for him, and I just want to help him, but I don't know how. Sometimes I'm worried that he's not real, that this is all a dream, or I'm seeing things again.
Again?
When he disappeared, Dan began. I told my family I could sometimes still see him and hear him. When my family said it wasn't real, he went away, and I was able to be free of him. But I wonder if it's all fake again.
Dan, is this why you're here? This question seemed to have piqued your interest.
I guess so. I know it sounds stupid, but we did everything together. He disappeared. My best friend disappeared. I tried coming to therapy to talk about it, but I never could. I could never talk about it. Again, I'm just so fucking... Wait, can I cuss?
Of course.
Dr. Vero chuckled slightly. I'm just so fucking afraid.
What is it that you're afraid of, Mr. Howell?
I think I'm... Dan licked his lips, looking up at the man. I think I'm afraid of him. Chapter 4.
So, how'd it go?
It was alright. He says he's diagnosing me with depression and anxiety, but I already figured as such.
Did you tell him about me? Phil looked at Dan as he took a bite of his pizza. Dan had asked to go out, but Phil refused to leave the house.
No.
You hesitated.
Are you ever gonna leave the house?
Dan questioned, changing the subject. He set his food down, blocking out the TV.
Are we just gonna eat delivery food forever?
I'll go out when it's safe.
And when is that?
Dan furrowed his eyebrows. He didn't want to get angry, but it's been weeks now. He wanted answers.
And when will it be normal again? You haven't touched me since you came back. Haven't even looked at me in a lustful way. Did you go to someone else? Did you cheat?
Jesus Christ. Dan, you're being selfish. That's not what happened. Phil stood up, running his hands over his face, pacing the living room.
I'm being selfish?
Dan got up too.
Phil, you're making me insane. I'm so lost. I'm in the dark, and you've taken the batteries out of the flashlight. Did you see the corkboard in the trash? All that work I did to try and find you? I had clues, and now it's like you fucking wiped them all away. Why did you come back? How did you come back?
Phil whipped around, fists clenched. Stop asking me all these questions. Dan got closer to him, eyes watered as he shouted.
Why? Tell me why! Tell me one fucking reason to any of this!
I can't! Phil screamed. Silence followed. Dan laughed, coldly, turning away, putting his uneaten pizza in a box.
I've lost my appetite.
Daniel mumbled, going to the bathroom and slamming the door. He passed the time watching old videos of him and Phil, noting the changes from the past to the present. He wishes he could go back and somehow save Phil from ever disappearing. Save him from ever leaving the house.
Phil, could you come in here?
Dan called as he shut his laptop. Phil appeared, the atmosphere tense.
I have a proposition.
He said, sitting on the edge of the bed.
Maybe we could go on a vacation.
Dan started, getting closer to his boyfriend and leaning his head on his shoulder.
I think it could ease our stress, and that way we could go out without you knowing anybody. We could go to some island, you know?
Phil breathed slowly, thinking. Okay, but you...
Can't tell anybody. I get it.
Dan shut him down.
I'll look up flights tonight, okay? For now, we should sleep.
A few days later, they found themselves landing on an island. They were swarmed with locals bargaining for deals and experiences, but Phil wanted it just to be them two. Dan hoped that he would get answers tonight, or at least at some point on the trip. They stopped at their house, a rented beach house, all to itself. It was nice. A 2-story with a hot tub and a bar. Dan was sat in the water watching the sun go down as he sipped on a cocktail. He felt a hand touch his shoulder suddenly, and he jumped, spilling a bit of his drink on his thigh. It was simply Phil, who began giggling at his boyfriend's reaction. Sorry, he forced a smile, climbing into the tub. He looked out at the sky for a moment, listening to the ocean breeze and pelicans chirp from afar. Dan stared at him the whole time, thoughts flooding his brain. You gonna enjoy the view?
I am.
Dan flirted. Phil rolled his eyes, playfully shoving him.
You seem like you're in a good mood. I'm gonna get another drink. Do you want anything?
Phil responded with a yes, and it wasn't the last drink. Soon enough, the two men were drunk, babbling until the sun went down, and the moon peeked up. Dan went to kiss him, and Phil let him, and they kissed for a long time. Dan? Phil exhaled. Dan thought he was simply saying his name, so he kept mouthing at his neck. Phil repeated his name, and Dan stopped pulling away and looking at him. What would you do if I hurt someone?
Did you?
Dan asked. No. The reply was sharp. He stood up, moving away from Dan. The brunette followed him, though, angry and frustrated. Too many times had Phil been on the verge of ending his confusion. Too many questions Dan had unanswered.
Did you hurt someone?
Dan snarled. Phil kept his back to him.
Would you just answer me, please? God damn it, Phil, I do so much for you. I've been as patient as I can be. But you were missing for years. No clues, no hints, no search parties. You were presumed to be dead. We had a fucking funeral, a casket with no body in it. What happened, Phil?
Dan shouted, grabbing his shoulder. Get off me! Phil snapped, going to shove at Dan, but he slipped. He slipped on the stray water from the hot tub and scraped his leg, blood instantly beginning to appear.
Shit!
Dan hissed, kneeling down, looking at the wound. Phil just groaned in pain.
We need to get you to a doctor. You need stitches.
No.
But you're injured!
I didn't want to go to the doctor. Dan remained silent for a bit, stunned at how aggressive his boyfriend was being. He just wanted to help. That's all he ever wanted to do.
I'll go get the first aid kit.
Dan murmured, tears welling in his eyes. Phil didn't seem to notice his boyfriend was crying, holding his crimson-covered leg. Daniel came back out with bandages, cleaning off the blood and wrapping the wound. He helped Phil back to their bed, and tension reoccurred. I'm sorry, Phil mumbled. You just have so many questions that I'm unable to answer. Some I don't want to answer. Please, just forget about me disappearing. I'm here now. Stop focusing on the past. Dan shook his head, tears slightly spilling down his cheeks.
You tried to shove me.
What?
When I touched you, you tried to shove me. You tried to hurt me.
Dan.
I'm your boyfriend. I'm not the enemy or whatever the fuck you encountered when you were gone.
Dan sniffled.
Maybe you're the enemy here.
Baby, you know that's not...
Don't baby me! Not after what just happened.
Dan. Phil corrected. He paused. Just come here, please. I'm tired of fighting. No more fighting. Especially not on this getaway. We came here to feel better, right? Let me make you feel better.
How do you plan on doing that?
Dan pouted. Phil said nothing, just kissed him, and Dan got the message. He hoped things would always be so gentle like this. However, all good things come to an end.
Chapter 5. Dan woke up bare and under the sheets. Phil was up, sitting out on the balcony and already dressed. Dan slipped on sweatpants and headed out, wrapping himself around Phil. Phil jumped a bit, but relaxed upon realizing it was Dan.
You alright?
Phil asked him. Very. Dan let himself smile. He relished in the skin-on-skin contact for a moment before sitting. You know...
What if we just stayed here?
What? Dan sputtered.
What if you moved out to a place like this? I could actually go out.
So, he's not safe in London, but safe anywhere else. Another clue, Dan noted. I don't know, Phil. Let's think about it, okay? It wasn't brought up again. The vacation went on, and Dan began to warm up to Phil. Sure, he didn't have the answers he wanted, but at least he had the opportunity to even ask him questions. When they arrived at the airport after packing up, Dan's phone rang. He excused himself and hobbled towards a corner, seeing it was an unknown number, but answering anyway. Hello? He murmured.
Is this Daniel James Howell? I'm Detective Ramos.
Dan gulped. He remembered the many calls he'd have to answer when Phil first went missing. He'd listened to the little clues or new findings that never seemed to help. But this was different. Those calls had stopped long ago. Yes, ma'am. Is there something I should know?
We've discovered more facts about your missing boyfriend.
Dan turned to peek at his boyfriend, who was playing with his hands nervously. He shook his head and turned back into the conversation. Like, what?
It's necessary that I discuss these with you in person. I'll text you the address. And remember that this will all remain confidential. Thank you for your time, Mr. Howell.
Dan couldn't even bring himself to say goodbye, instead just quietly hanging up the phone. He stared at Phil, guilt and indecision filling his mind. If he wasn't going to get answers from Phil, he'd get it from someone that wanted them too. When they got back, Dan waited till Phil fell asleep. He knew he'd be jet-lagged and insisted on taking a nap, so when he fell asleep around 5, he crept into their room and dug through his clothes. He was just about to give up, finding nothing, until he felt paper crumble in a pocket. He furrowed his eyebrows, staring at the jeans, almost afraid to look at what it was. He prayed it was just a receipt for something or an old photograph, but when he pulled it out, his heart nearly dropped. It was their address. Phil had known it by heart, so why was it written in the pocket of his jeans? The night he came back, their address was in his pocket. Phil made a noise behind him, and Dan jumped, whipping around only to see that Phil was still asleep. He stared at the paper once more, letting his mind run. Phil knew it. No matter how far they went, Phil always knew their way back to the house. Was he tortured so bad he forgot? Did he have to look it up? And if he did, why didn't he have his phone to check? He went to shove it back in the pocket when he felt a stinging pain on his finger, hissing a bit too loud and pulling his hand away. Blood began to form on his finger from a small cut, and looked down at the jeans before carefully digging in the same pocket. He pulled out an open pocket knife, and just as he did, he heard Phil behind him.
Dan, what are you doing?
Daniel jumped in fear, standing up and whipping around to face him. He still had the knife in his hand, now hiding it behind his back. It was dark in the room, with the blinds shut, so it was hard to make out much. I was getting clothes to do a load of laundry. Why do you have a knife in your jeans? Why do you have our address? Why is there a knife and our address in your fucking jeans? Dan wanted to scream, but he stayed frozen until Phil mumbled.
Okay.
I'm also about to head out for therapy, Dan lied, and Dan could barely find it himself to feel bad. Phil kept things from him all the time. It's not like he was any worse than him, lying to him.
Okay.
Phil said again, nuzzling himself back into the pillow.
Be careful.
Dan gripped the knife tighter, nodding and hurrying up the room. Once he shut the door, he examined the knife for a second, wondering what to do with it. He didn't want to give it back to Phil. He didn't know why he even had it. He exhaled, pulling up the sofa cushion and shoving it under after closing the weapon. With that, he grabbed his coat and hurried over to the police station. When he parked, he noticed how many police cars were parked, his PTSD hitting him with flashbacks from when the cops showed up at his house looking for Phil. That was the night he found out he was really gone. He remembers the red and blue lights. He had been sitting on the sofa, Phil on his mind. He was sitting in the dark living room, nothing on, nobody speaking. Just him in the darkness until he heard the sirens, and the red and blue lights flashing along his walls. The red and blue lights covering his walls, just like his melancholy thoughts covered his brain. The red and blue lights. He took a breath, trying to ease his shaking hands before entering the building. He let himself walk through, the place all too familiar. It made him sick to his stomach, remembering coming in this place hysterically and begging for closure on his missing partner. He sat down and let himself people watch until a voice rang through his ears.
Dan Howell?
He looked up to see a Middle Eastern woman with big eyes and long dark hair. Her hand was extended with the intention of Daniel shaking it. He hesitantly did, lost in thought.
I'm Detective Ramos. We talked on the phone.
She smiled politely as Dan rose.
If you'll just follow me.
He nodded, forcing a small smile before following her into the room. He looked around at the rooms as they walked through a dark hall. Lawyers and criminals filled in the rooms. He entered the room, seeing the guard inside the room and beige files on the table. He gulped and stepped inside, letting the door shut behind him. Chapter 6.
We've managed to reach his therapist and uncover his diagnosis.
Isn't this illegal?
Dan questioned, a bright hanging light above them. Not if it's necessary, in a case as such. Dan watched as Detective Ramos opened the file, sliding the papers to Dan. He read over it. Insomnia. Which he knew.
How would him having insomnia affect his case, though?
Insomnia can cause hallucinations. Your body needs sleep, so once it's extremely deprived of it, it fails to function correctly, and can cause such things. Dan's eyes flickered to her name tag for a second. Alice Ramos. He continued reading.
What about dissociative amnesia?
It's the brain's disruption of memory and sense of reality. These two factors could relate to why he's gone.
Why didn't I know this?
Dan mumbled, more to himself than the woman. Dr. Vero, said Phil. Dan's eyes quickly shot at Alice's.
Dr. Vero?
Yes, sir. She continued on with her explanation, but Dan's heartbeat was much louder than any chaos going on around him. That's his therapist. They had the same therapist? Dan had never checked. All these stories he'd been telling about his lost dog, it was all about his patient, but he never knew. What if he knew that it was him, but didn't want to pour salt on his reopened wounds? Mr. Howell, are you alright?
It's a lot.
I understand, and we want everything to come into place just as much as you do. We'll be doing our best to figure out what happened, even if it takes a while.
It's been months.
The room went silent after Dan's dismissive tone. Dan spoke again.
What if he wanted to leave?
What? She furrowed her eyebrows.
What if he's not really missing? What if it's more so a runaway? What if he wanted to get away from someone or something and doesn't want to be found?
Dan, it just doesn't line up with what's happened.
Maybe it will. Give me a few days.
He stood up quickly and grabbed his coat.
I'll be back.
Alice called after him, but he was already out the door. Speeding to a building he went to for feeling of safety, but now going for danger. He scurried up to his therapist's office, knocking on the door. Dan, what are you?
I know I don't have a scheduled appointment, but I just need to talk.
Dan said, breathing heavy. Dr. Vero eyed him, but silently opened the door wider, letting him in. You're lucky I'm not with any of my other patients right now. Dan cut him off again.
Could you give me water?
Once again, Dr. Vero stared at him with an uneasy expression, hesitating before leaving the room. Dan sighed in relief. His plan working. He quickly opened the drawers looking for files, looking for something more about him. About Phil. It took a few drawers, but Dan found his name. Phil Lester. He grabbed the file, dragging it out, examining it further, when he heard footsteps. He panicked, standing up and shoving the folder into his hoodie. He bumped into the therapist on his way out of the room. Are you leaving?
Yeah, I'm just caught up in something. I'll see you next week.
Dan lied, in a hurry to leave. He left his therapist, water in his hand, and confusion etched on his face. He didn't have an intention to steal the file altogether. It was more obvious and illegal that way. He just wanted to snap pictures, but timing was too short. He went back to the house, pleased to hear Phil was in the shower. He took the opportunity to look over the files in their office, sitting down and opening the folder. He was a patient for around a year when he stopped coming. Blue eyes, those blue eyes, Dan adored so much. Dark hair, the darkest and most beautiful shade Dan could run his fingers through. Pale skin on the body that would hold Dan like it was the last time. And now it was different. It was all different. He found some things about himself that Phil had said Dan was the only thing that made him feel safe. But why would he feel unsafe anywhere else? He furrowed his eyebrows, going to his room to get his laptop before going back to the office. He opened it and did research, looking up signs of abuse and other trauma or illness. And maybe this wasn't even about past Phil, but also present Phil. Because the two are not the same, and disappearing doesn't explain all of it. He read over one that caught his eye.
Phil wishes he could tell his boyfriend certain things, but can't.
Dan stared, eyes wide and breath caught in his throat. It's always been like this. Then, just less obvious? Phil was always hiding, even before missing. Dan remembered putting up so many missing posters around their neighborhood, but maybe Phil didn't want to be found. Just understood. Maybe he wanted to be found by the person who found him in the first place. Dan. But instead, he just showed up, misunderstood and misleading. He ran a hand through his hair. They were together for years, best friends for months before. But was it really best friends if Phil couldn't tell him secrets? Or is it that Phil couldn't tell him? He shook away the thoughts, shutting his laptop and getting ready to hide away the folder, when he spotted a picture peeking out from under a piece of paper. He slowly took it out, squinting at the image. It was Phil, his parents, and the rest was snipped off. The page underneath explained the photograph attached was Phil's family. Phil had someone else in his family, and obviously had tension with them, an uncovered secret.
Maybe they know something I don't.
Dan thought. He remembered where his parents lived, and mentally made note to make a trip to the Lester's household as soon as possible. As if on cue, Dan heard the shower turn off and hid all the evidence. Already faking his act for Phil, but maybe Phil was acting too.
Chapter 7. Dan was eating breakfast with Phil when the doorbell rang. They both tensed up. They exchanged glances and Dan whispered at him to go hide, and Phil obliged, running into the closet. Dan took a breath, setting his bowl of cereal down before going to his door. His hands shook as he looked through the peephole, seeing his parents. What the hell? Dan mumbled to himself. He made it clear he wanted no communication with anyone from his past. However, he opened the door, meeting his parents' worried faces. "What are you doing here?"
Your therapist called us.
His mom began, desperate eyes and an awkward smile.
He said you haven't been acting right, more than usual. He's worried, and we are too. You never returned our calls, so your father and I decided to come see you, and thank God you're okay.
She pulled him into a hug, holding him tightly. Dan let himself be hugged. Then his dad pulled him in, patting his back and ruffling his hair after pulling away. Dan looked at his parents with big eyes. They looked older, sick even, and Dan knew it was his fault. The dark circles, the messy hair, it was all stress he caused. You can't, Dan swallowed, hating he had to tell them to leave. Truthfully, he missed them. He was just hard-headed and scared. He couldn't let anyone else close again. You can't be here.
Dan, don't say that. Please, it's been so long. We tried to give you time to cope, but we're your family.
Dan's father countered. Dan numbly moved out of their way, shutting the door after them. His mom eyed the second bowl of cereal on the table before looking at him.
2 bowls? Have you found someone?
His mother said, hopefulness in her tone. Dan hurriedly picked up the bowls, setting them in the kitchen. No, just wanted to eat 2 different brands at the same time. Dan excused awkwardly. His parents slowly nodded, not believing him but not pushing any further. Tea? When his parents agreed, he busied himself making them their drinks.
So, you're going to therapy. That's good.
His mom began, sitting on the couch.
That's really good.
Dan just nodded, giving them their tea and sitting in the chair diagonal to the sofa. His dad took a seat next to his mom. Mrs. Howell's eyes were watery. Not enough to spill tears, but enough to sparkle with sadness.
I'm sorry, it's just a lot.
She dismissed herself, waving her hand before wiping her eyes.
We love you. You know that.
I know, Dan said, and he really did know. He just hated that it was true. He hated how much pain he threw onto them. I love you guys too. Just then there was a noise from the closet, where Phil hid. Dan's parents went quiet, giving their son a look.
Dan, seriously, is someone here?
Mrs. Howell questioned, standing.
It's completely okay if that's the case. We want you to be happy.
Dan paused. He could lie and say no, but it'd just worry his parents more. He could say yes, but tell them he wasn't ready to introduce them yet. That plan could work. They'd leave him alone about it. So Dan mentally crossed his fingers and replied, Okay, yes, I have someone I'm kind of seeing, but I'm not ready to introduce them yet, okay? Please just leave it alone and do not tell anybody at all. His mom gave him a worried eye before sighing, petting the side of his arm.
How are you doing? Dan, you aren't going to do anything bad, right? Phil meant a lot to us, too, and we can't lose you, too.
Dan gulped, throat suddenly feeling dry. Was he suicidal? That wouldn't make any sense, though, would it? Phil was back. He should be happy. He should want to be alive, but something felt off. He couldn't honestly answer, so he just leaned his head on his mom's shoulder.
You can always be back with us, if you want. We hate you being alone here.
I'll be okay, he told them. His dad flashed him a soft smile. Thank you, though. Maybe I'll come visit. He hated saying maybe, but he couldn't make promises. After a bit of talking and finishing up their tea, they told him they'd leave him alone for now. That he could call them whenever he needed, even just to say hello, and that they loved him. But the worst part was when his father brought up his old friends, told him they all missed him and asked about him whenever they could. He shut the door on their way out, standing while wallowing in his sadness for a bit. He didn't realize how much he missed his friends until now. He was ready to sit in self-pity for the rest of the night when Phil appeared from behind. Hey, Dan began softly, but Phil was anything but melancholy. He was angry.
You told them you're with someone?
They were curious, and it was pretty obvious. That doesn't mean they know it's you, don't worry, Dan murmured, grabbing the empty bowls of cereal and heading to put them in the dishwasher.
I give you one simple rule. I told you to never tell anyone I'm here.
Phil said, eyes suddenly dark. Dan stepped back. I didn't, the brunette shot back, glaring. I said someone is here. Phil, even if I wanted to tell someone you came back, they wouldn't believe me.
It doesn't matter,
Phil shouted, making Dan jump as he smacked glass bowls out of his hands. They hit the floor with a clash, glass shattering around their feet. Dan stood in shock, trembling with his lips parted. His fear morphed into envy, and he gritted his teeth. His eyes locked with Phil's as he hissed. I liked you better when you were missing. He regretted it as soon as he said it. But honestly, it wasn't entirely a lie. Phil just stared at him with big eyes. Hard to read. Dan shook his head, clenching his fists, releasing and giving up as he stormed into his bedroom. He slammed his door shut, sitting and leaning against it. As he sat, he felt something hard poke him and found his phone in his pocket. He pulled it out, eyeing it before making a decision. He scrolled through his contacts, hitting one and sending a message that read, "I need to talk to you." Chapter 8.
He waited until Phil was asleep to get up from their bed. Dan crept out in his sweatshirt and sweatpants, sneaking out of the front door successfully. His eyes searched and locked on a dark figure, nearly blending in with the dark around them. Dan smiled to himself, in relief to finally seeing someone he knew after so long, washing over him. His feet followed each other, one after another, as he crept towards the figure moving to him.
"I missed you,"
Dan let himself say, and the figure came into view. His sister, Delilah. She was slender, with green eyes and brown hair, a mother of two, and a husband back home. They had always been close, especially when Dan started breaking once Phil left. But he pushed her away, just like everyone else. And now he was letting her in again. She starts running to him, their bodies clashing in a tight hug. "I'm so glad you texted me. I've been thinking about you non-stop. The kids always ask how Uncle Danny is." Dan let his lips curl up at the mention of his nieces, still in disbelief that his beautiful sister was really here. He missed talking to her, even just in general. He would never admit it, but he missed her the most out of everyone he pushed away. Delilah started to go inside before Dan could stop her.
You can't come inside,"
he stammers, trying to think of an excuse as to why, when she asks. He gives up and speaks.
I have to tell you something."
She furrowed her eyebrows, clutching her coat closer and shifting her weight. "What is it?" She's worried, Dan can tell. He already feels bad for putting this burden on her. She didn't have to know. She didn't have to know. Dan starts to panic, eyes watering before he could stop it. She reaches out and pets his shoulder. For a second, lips in a tight line. Please don't shut me out again."
"You can't tell anyone. And this is not some kind of kindergarten secret. It's not. This is to be kept secret for your own safety. Mine and yours, okay?"
She let go of his shoulder, inching into herself as fear filled her from head to toe. "Daniel, what is going on?" Before he could finally admit it, finally letting everything out that he is suffering keeping in, his phone beeps. He pulled out of his pocket and reads, "If you tell her, I'll hurt her." Dan gulped. Already knows that he must have bought a burner. Before he could respond, another text sent. "Don't think I won't." Dan stared at his phone in pure terror before he peeked over his shoulder, noticing the living room light inside his home was now on. Phil was awake. "Is it about Phil?" Delilah asked. Dan nodded. He hated himself instantly. He's already in deep now. She'll know, and he'll tell her. He has to.
"He's here,"
Dan says, and it feels like it's out of his control at this point, like a parasite took over his body, and he's simply a puppet on a string, controlled by anxiety.
"He's back. He came back a while ago, and he's been threatening me not to tell anyone, but I'm so confused. I don't know what to believe."
Dan, you were diagnosed with schizophrenia just a few months ago. You can't possibly think. Delilah trailed off, and he knows that her response is not only her trying to reason with him, but reason with herself. You can't.
"He's been here. That's why I went back to therapy. Why all these things are suddenly happening. He's inside. I'll prove it."
Before she can protest, Dan took her by the wrist and dragged her inside. He paces around the house for a second, first trying to find him. He spotted Phil by the window, back turned to him. Dan crept back to his sister, gesturing her to enter the bedroom. But when he turns back to the room, he's gone. The curtain from the window sways in the wind. No sight of Phil. Delilah makes eye contact with her brother, sympathy glazing over her eyes. She thinks he's crazy. Oh no, she thinks he's crazy.
"I'm not,"
Dan begins, but his throat burns. "Why don't you come home for a bit? Come stay with us. You could be with the girls. They miss you. It could be good for you." Dan opens his mouth to protest, to try and argue one last time, but he obliges, shamefully, and finds himself packing his bag. Delilah awaits in the living room, and Dan can't stop thinking, where did he go? Or was Dan's schizophrenia lingering, intensifying? He zips up his bag, following his sister into the car and listening to the engine start. He's driving away in the car, and he wonders if Phil's going somewhere, if he has somewhere he wants to be. He wonders if it's really Phil.
Chapter 9.
Uncle Danny!
Dan's face morphed into a toothy grin at the sound of his nieces as he walked into the door. The two girls hugged his legs, and he looked up to see his brother-in-law, Jackson. Jax, Dan greeted, pulling him into a hug, pulling off and patting his back.
How have you been? You okay?
Jax furrowed his eyebrows, analyzing Dan's face, almost as if to get an unspoken answer. Dan just shrugged and went back to playing with the girls. He couldn't help but notice how tense his sister and her husband were, already knowing that she had told him what happened. Dan zoned out for a second as the girls leaped around him, pondering and trying to guess where Phil was. Once again. It was a fucking repeat. A full circle. A 360 loop. And here Dan was, right back at square one. Where did Phil go? Who was he? What was he?
Dan, I'll show you to the guest room.
His thoughts were cut short at the voice of his timid sibling, her hand light on his shoulder. Dan followed quietly, bags heavy in his grip. He set his things down by the bed, a wooden headboard and beige sheets on display. The room was plain, obviously never used. His sister left to leave, but stopped in the doorway to look over at him.
Dan?
He hummed, still taking in the room.
I'm glad you're back.
Dan made eye contact with Delilah, a sad smile on his chapped lips. Me too. Dan didn't know if he meant it. Dan awoke with a stir, not realizing he had fallen asleep. He was still in full clothing, bags unpacked and the sun now in hiding. It was night, an unknown time, and Dan got up groggily. He moved quietly, walking through the hall and seeing all doors closed. He found a clock, reading it was 11 p.m., just 4 hours till Phil ran the other night. He felt his throat lodge and pushed on through, finding himself in the kitchen and seeing a plate of leftover pasta on the counter. He spotted a note by it and picked it up.
You slept through dinner. Please eat when you find this.
He grinned at the kindness of his sister, setting the food in the oven to heat it. He hummed a tune as he paced around the house, going by the window to go through vinyl records. It was so quiet, the household deep in their sleep except Dan. The only light in the house was the kitchen, overhead, and the moonlight peeking through the curtains. He looked up from the records and froze. Phil, just outside the window, in the raven black of the night, was stood a raven-haired boy. Phil. In the yard, in the same clothes he was in when he ran. When he ran away. Dan screamed, backing away into the bar stools of the kitchen. He heard a bedroom door swing open, and his brother-in-law came into view with sleepy but wide eyes.
What? Dan, what is it?
Delilah appeared behind her husband, eyes filled with concern for her vulnerable brother. Dan's big eyes locked with Jack's, before turning back to the window, finding Phil was no longer there. Dan started, eyes watering. He didn't even really know why. He was so overwhelmed and the voices swarmed his head like a nest of angry bees. Everything was so loud. He couldn't think. He couldn't find something to say that would make him sound any less insane. It was inevitable. It was bad. It was all bad.
Did you see him, Daniel?
His full name ran off her tongue, a hard smash to his heart. It gave him flashbacks to when he was a kid, when he'd tell his parents he was seeing monsters and they'd always coax him with his full name, never the nickname Dan. Apparently this was seeing another monster, but much worse. Dan was about to speak, but the rest of the family came down the stairs. His two favorite nieces appeared behind their parents, clinging to their mother's clothing in fear. Fear. Dan attracted terror. That's all he ever did. That's all he ever did. He scared his parents with talk. He scared his sister with talk. He scared himself. He was a walking nightmare, like dreaming in California, the uncertainty of an earthquake always lingering. I cannot stay here, Dan whimpered. He was so tired of scaring people away. They were a good family, a good, stable family full of lovely, deserving people. I cannot.
Maybe you should...
I am not going back there, Dan growled sternly, tears still pricking at his bloodshot eyes. They had already sent him there, Send him to a place for crazy people, just for a few weeks, but it felt like months. He couldn't do it. He wasn't crazy. He couldn't be. Not again.
If he wants to leave, let him leave, Delilah.
Jax tells his wife. He understands Dan. It's obvious. Understands that there is only scarce darkness, only the breath of a demon in the back of everyone's minds. Dan hugged his two nieces, and they hugged him just as tightly. I'm sorry. I'll get better. They just gazed up at him as he scurried up to the guest room, packing his things. He patted Jax on the shoulder after leaving the room, finding him tense and full of sympathy. Everyone always felt sorry for him. Once out of the house, his sister led him to the car and they drove him back to his home in silence. When they got there, he walked inside into his bedroom, beginning to unpack his things. His sister stood there in the doorway, silent tears tiptoeing down her cheeks as she sniffled. She watched him as he finished packing, and once done, she goes under his chin to wrap him in a hug.
It's not your fault. None of this is.
Dan just sadly smiled, admiring the somber Delilah before taking in a breath and brushing past her. She stayed in the room. He could feel his eyes on her, but there was no turning back. No turning back. He was getting his answers now. He let her out, and she gave him one last look of worry. Once alone, he picked up his phone, dialing someone he didn't know he could trust, but had to. There were no choices now. Only force. Only distress. He hears the phone ring, and then a feminine voice replaces it.
Dan?
Detective Ramos? I have something to tell you. Chapter 10.
I believe you. Dan, after struggling to breathe for so long, felt like he could finally breathe again, after being denied so many times, being told he was insane, and seen as some kind of danger. Someone finally believed him. Believed in him. Detective Ramos, Alice, stood in front of him. It was 1 a.m, and Dan had not slept. They were in the back of a room at the office, lights menacing like the situation. Their conversation was seared through whispers, and Dan told her everything.
You don't think I'm crazy?
He stares at her, her eyes wide, full of an infusion of terror and relief.
You think he's real?
It's possible. We haven't found him in forever, Daniel. It makes sense if it were because his body wasn't staying in one spot.
But what do you think is wrong with him?
That I can't pinpoint. You have to find someone else who knows him well, besides yourself. Dan winced. Always had he been praised and playfully teased for being Phil's walking inbox. He knew everything about him, physically and emotionally. He never grew tired of learning about his best friend, about his boyfriend. He stopped to think about who might know about him. The answer came quickly. His parents. Dan hadn't seen them since Phil's funeral, nor heard from them. He felt like it was wrong to try and talk to them, a shattered reflection in the mirror of their child. But this, he had to do. He went to the door, turning back, looking at Alice.
I need you to come with me. I can't be alone anymore. And bring your gun.
What? Am I supposed to shoot you if all goes wrong? She attempted to joke.
No.
Dan held onto the doorknob, fist clenched. He turned away from her.
Shoot him.
A deafening silence pierced between the pair after those words, the overwhelming sense of reality settling in. This was a relationship where it was no longer comfort and safety. It was fear and danger. Alice and Dan went to the car, no one questioning their frantic exit. It was a long drive, or at least it felt like it, with Dan's thoughts flooding his mind and drowning out all potential contentment. Pulling into the driveway of the Lesters made Dan's ability to swallow disappear. Memories of the two coming here for the holidays or weekends ran through his head, giving him a headache. Alice noticed his anxiety and put a hand on his shoulder, and he flinched. She hesitantly removed her hand, smiling half-heartedly. You ready?
Never was.
Dan takes a breath, and the two stepped out of the car, and Dan is the first to reach the door. He knocks, the familiar noises sounding so much louder in his ears. Phil's mother peeks through the window, her blue eyes meeting Dan's bloodshot ones. He watched her tense, and she opens the door slowly, as if she didn't know what he'd do. Dan Howell? She breathed out, her words scraping off her tongue, like a test.
Mrs. Lester?
He smiled sadly. He didn't realize how much he missed his second family until now. They were always so welcoming, so grateful for Dan being in Phil's life. The door swung open, and Mrs. Lester threw herself at him, hugging him close as if it was her own son returning. She began sobbing immediately, clinging to him, as if he had gone missing too. Really, he might as well have been. As he held the smaller woman, her husband appeared in the doorway, and his mouth opened. "Dan?" he said, a shocked smile revealing itself as he joined the hug. "Please come in." Alice and Dan entered the house, and Dan introduced.
"This is Detective Ramos. We need to talk to you about something."
Mrs. Lester nodded them over to the living room couch, the married couple sitting on the one parallel, their hands automatically intertwined, and Dan's eyes moved from their fingers to the pictures that hung on the walls. Still, there were so many pictures of Phil, still so many pictures of their family. "Phil is
still missing,"
Dan cut in. Alice gave him a look of confusion. He wasn't ready to tell them he was alive. They didn't deserve to have their broken glass shattered even more. He'd just ask questions and leave.
"But we have questions."
Alice sighed, a sign that she'd let him do the talking. "Of course." Mrs. Lester forced a smile, eyes tired and weak, seeming like they were drowned in tears long ago, now just corpse. Dan tried. He didn't know what to ask.
"Can I see photo albums of him?"
Honestly, it had no relevance to the situation, but he wanted, even for a second, to pretend like he wasn't losing his mind. He wanted to pretend like it was the holidays again, and Phil was next to him, blushing and pouting, as his parents and Dan went through baby photos of him. They both nodded, and Mr. Lester disappeared for a quick second. "Do you mind if I wander around?" Alice asked. "Please, make yourself at home," Mrs. Lester told her. Alice gave Dan a look saying,
"I hope we'll find something that will help."
And Dan's look replied,
"Me too."
Mr. Lester returned, and the couple moved to sit on either side of the brunette man, placing the books in his hand. They went through it, and they laughed and cried, as they went through photos of his beloved. So many of him smiling, and so many of them together, Dan and Phil, just like it always was. Finally, they reached the end of all the books, and Dan came to a torn photograph.
"What's this?"
His pale, slender fingers picked it up, and his newfound focus sent him a punch to the gut. He heard Alice re-enter the room, but he remained frozen. It was the missing piece from the photo he had found in Phil's evidence, back at the house. The ripped photo of their family. A person cut out. This was the person. But it was Phil. It was Phil, even though there was already one in the original photograph. "That's Peter," Mr. Lester began hesitantly. "Phil's twin."
Chapter 11. Dan jolted up, instantly feeling like he was going to vomit. "Why didn't I know about him?"
"They didn't get along,"
Mrs. Lester softly explained.
"He moved out pretty quick. Dan, what's going on? You're white as snow."
Dan shook his head and ran to the kitchen sink, vomiting out barely anything to let his lack of eating. Alice hurried over, patting his back.
"Daniel?"
Mr. Lester said, worry dripping from his voice like the faucet next to him. It was so loud, the faucet dripping. "Did he ever come to visit?"
"The last time we saw him was around the time of Phil's disappearance. He was so upset."
Alice gripped tightly onto Dan's arm, almost as if to keep him from slipping away, to keep him from disappearing like his boyfriend.
"Dan, we should go. Can one of you tell us what is going on?"
Mrs. Lester cried out, eyes watering.
"If you know something about my baby, please, I'm begging you."
"Peter killed him!" Dan screamed, throat nearly tearing like Phil's soul from his body when Peter must have murdered him.
"Dan!"
Alice hissed, fear storming the room like a tornado. Dan was a tornado, a storm, and he couldn't stop. "I have to go," Dan breathed out, hands shaking just as bad as they did when the cops had come to tell him that Phil was missing. The red and blue lights flashing over their walls and across his porcelain skin. I need to go."
"Dan."
Mr. Lester reached his hand out, but Dan pushed past him, Alice following suit. "I'll fix this," Dan promised and left the house. The house he once called his second home but now felt like solitary confinement. He rushed to the car, Alice chasing after him. Dan stopped in his place, eyebrows furrowing. "Stay here."
"Dan,
"It's not safe." Alice glared, beginning to worriedly protest.
It's my job."
"You want to know what my job was?" Dan began, tears beginning to slip from his eyes. I worked with my boyfriend, and my second job was simply just taking care of him. I loved it. I loved both jobs because I loved him. And now, his voice broke. Now I find out that he's been dead all along. Phil is dead.
We don't know that.
We do. You think I don't know my own boyfriend? My Phil would never act this way. My Phil... This is not him. And whoever it is, I'm going to make them sorry. He shoved cash in her hand, telling her to catch a taxi home and get some rest. And with that, he hopped in the car and drove off. He looked up in the rearview, seeing Alice's figure lost of hope until he took a turn and she was gone. Gone just like Phil. He sped through the drive and parked roughly in front of their dorm, suddenly having the urge to burn the place down. Burn it down to demolish the false memories and intangible happiness. When he opens the car door, he remembered Alice still had the gun, and Dan was weaponless, until he realized he still had the knife in his pocket from his false boyfriend. He reached the door, walking into their bedroom and pulling up the cushion to thankfully still have the knife there. The front door opened and he made a decision. He'd walk in there and let him do the talking. When their eyes met once Dan was in the living room, his knife hidden in his jeans, tension filled the already thin air. The man stared at him, and they kept their distance. The black-haired boy still in the doorway, and Dan by the bedroom.
I know you know.
Dan gulped. What do you mean?
You think I'm stupid.
The house is dark. Just the living room lamp was on, everything dim and hard to make out. But one thing was sure. This was not Phil. Dan's mouth dried, too dry to reply. So the man kept going, taking slow steps toward him, like a panther ready to pounce on its prey.
I see you at your sister's house. You're going to therapy, acting weird. I know you know.
I don't... Dan cut himself off, shrinking into himself as he was shoved to the ground, knife cutting the inside of his jeans. Dan groaned down to pain, sliding out the weapon and pointing at the man.
You couldn't stab me.
The man growled, almost like a dare.
I look too much like him.
The man stood over him, his looks once beautiful and radiating comfort, now red-hot and acidic. Peter, Dan seethed, fist shaking with the knife in his grip. Why did you do this?
My brother had everything. I had nothing. Nothing. For once, I wanted to put myself in his shoes. Have the perfect life, but it's all BS.
Why did you have to kill him?
I was dead to him, so why not make him dead to me?
But you came back, but...
Always so full of questions.
Peter spat, kicking at Dan's side.
I came back to get you to shut up, to stop looking into things, so I wouldn't get caught.
But I win, Dan sniffled, his voice trembling.
For now you do. For now, yes. You figured it all out. You solved the case. That remained on the office's corkboard for months. But the sad part is, you won't live to tell anyone. I'll kill you, just like I did your boyfriend. That was the plan all along. Don't you see? I'd gain your trust, and then kill you. So it seemed like suicide.
Dan cried. Don't touch me! He hoisted himself up from the wooden flooring, slashing his knife at Peter. You killed him! And for what? For nothing! For nothing! He continued slashing, Peter only dodging it and giving little to no reaction.
I got you to believe me, didn't I? Got you to believe that he came back? I was just planning on coming here, and you being my refuge. Planning on you to finally shut up and think Phil was back so I wouldn't be handed off to a cement room. But you wouldn't stop questioning everything.
Peter shoved at him on the last sentence, Dan's back hitting the wall. Get off me!
You couldn't even remember what your own boyfriend looked like. I have greener eyes, lighter hair. I don't even have one freckle on my back. Don't you remember your own boyfriend? Or did I kill him that long ago?
Dan let out a yelp and slashed at Peter's face, ripping through his shirt and cutting at his shoulder. He hissed, but continued spitting venom.
You could have had happiness again, but you're so self-destructive it's pathetic.
Dan slashed again, tearing through the front of his clothing and slicing at his chest. Peter killed Phil, the only person who ever fully understood Dan and everything he stood for. He killed everything and anything he ever loved. Now it was just emptiness. A fucking black hole or some kind of void, and he planned on drowning Peter in it.
He hid things from you. You didn't know everything about him like you so selfishly thought you did.
That's okay, Dan screamed, pushing him back and causing Peter to fall onto the TV, the device crashing off the table. That's okay, because he knew that he could talk to me about anything. That doesn't mean he had to. That doesn't mean anyone has to. Maybe he wasn't ready yet. Maybe he was going to tell me these things someday. About you, about his mental illnesses. But you took that from me. You took him. Dan screeched, tears beginning to spill from his eyes. He continued as Peter listened, still looking up at him from the ground. You took him from this earth, from his friends, from his own family, your own family. You're insane. You should have been the one going to therapy. You should be the one that's fucking dead. Peter, blood boiling with rage, kicks at Dan's leg and knocked him out. Dan fell as the knife fell from his grip, and Peter took the opportunity to climb on top of him. They began hitting and strangling at each other's clothes, each other's skin, blood beginning to seep from the cloth, from nails and teeth. He's been dead all along. Dan wishes that this man had been Phil's ghost, or a pigment of his schizophrenia. Anything but this. Knowing that his best friend was murdered by his own vengeful brother made his stomach churn and his heart throb. Everything hurt. Dan had a chance at shoving Peter off of him, and took it, throwing the demon somehow considered a human off of him. He grabbed the knife at the side of him, and when Peter turned to clamber back onto the brunette, everything slowed down. Dan's own breathing was suddenly very loud, the wheezing and stuttery cries leaving his mouth loud. Everything was so loud. Everything was so painful. He felt a pang in his chest and thought, he won, didn't he? He stabbed me. But he was wrong. It was just a sense of reality setting in. He took a hold of his heightened senses, his wide, tired eyes and his trembling lips. He turned his snowy white face to see the dying one next to him. He stabbed Peter. His eyes left from Peter's grasping mouth to the knife stuck in his chest. Peter lay there, hands shaking as he slowly accepted defeat. I remember my own boyfriend, Dan began as Peter lay dying, Dan's lips now numbing as he sobbed. I remember his blue eyes, and the freckles on his back. I can name them like a fucking constellation. I remembered his dark hair, darker than you, darker than his own personality, because he was always so light. I remember his porcelain skin that might as well have been made out of fine china, and his slender fingers that were always so cold but so warm to hold. Cop sirens began to follow his soliloquy in the background, volume growing as did Dan's. I remember that he liked exactly 2 packs of sugar in his coffee, and he loved his bacon extra crispy. I remember his favorite food was potato soup because he ate it all the time as a kid, and that he broke his leg twice. I remember that he loved reading books but never finished them, and loved live music but got anxious at concerts. I remember everything he wanted me to know, and the things he thought I didn't. I remember everything. I remember Phil. That's all that matters. As long as I keep him in my mind, as long as I love him like I always have, he'll keep living. He'll still be alive. That's all that ever mattered. Him. Peter took his last breath. His lips chapped and eyes that were once half-lidded now completely closed. He was dead. The red and blue lights began. The red and blue lights appeared, flashing over the walls in his porcelain skin. There was knocking, like the cops came to tell him his lover was gone. And the time he was fooled to think he came back. The doorknob jangled, and Dan remembered it was unlocked as cops began to flood the room. The brunette stayed on his knees, hands raising as flashlights were shined on him. Alice appeared behind the police, and she kneeled down to speak to him. The red and blue lights ceased to stop flashing.
You're not in trouble, Dan.
She coaxed as she helped lower his hands.
I told them everything. They know it was self-defense. You're a hero, Dan. You're Phil's hero. You always were.
He's all that matters, Dan spoke, the background shuffling of the cops analyzing Peter's body, sounding underwater.
I know.
He's all that ever mattered.
I know.